We have now reached the fourth and final stage in St. Seraphim's life, the stage during which he exercised to the fullest possible extent the ministry of the starets, the spiritual guide. As I have already mentioned, gradually he relaxed the strictness of his enclosure, and then from 1825 onwards, the last 8 years of his life, he received visitors freely and regularly went outside his cell, visiting a hermitage not too far in the forests this time. He had two hermitages, the Far Hermitage about 4 miles away from the monastery, where he was in an earlier period when he didn't receive anybody, but then the Near Hermitage, just perhaps about 2 miles away. Now, spiritual fathers, charismatic guides of the type of St. Seraphim, can exercise their ministry in various ways. For example, some spiritual guides are well known as letter writers, correspondents. That is the case, for example, with Bishop Theophan, the recluse, Zatvornik in Russian, who, after retiring as a bishop, did not receive any visitors face to face, but he answered letters, and we have many volumes of his letters. In other cases, spiritual guides might have preached sermons. This was done, for example, by a celebrated Russian priest who died in 1908, Saint John of Kronstadt. He would celebrate the liturgy daily in his church in Kronstadt, suburb of St. Petersburg, and then he preached and changed people's lives by his sermons. Now, St. Seraphim was not a great letter writer. We know he did receive letters. He would sometimes answer them without opening the letter or reading the contents. That's a convenient way to carry on your correspondence, saves time. But by and large, he's not remembered as a letter writer, and we don't have collections of his letters. Equally, it wasn't St. Seraphim's custom to preach sermons to large crowds. In general, he wasn't a writer. We have texts known as instructions, which are attributed to him, but this is not a book that he sat down and wrote, but it is a collection made after his death by others of his characteristic sayings. So St. Seraphim did not exercise his ministry through letters or through books or through sermons. He worked face to face, personal encounter, one to one. That was his characteristic way. He would talk directly to the other. And his words had great power, power to transform the lives of other people. It is interesting when we read the story of the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of St. John, how Christ brings back Lazarus from the dead, from the tomb, just with 3 words, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, restored to life. Unfortunately, most of us do not have the gift to change people's lives just with a few words. St. Seraphim, however, had that gift. He had the gift of insight. He could understand the person before him, understand that person even without being told. Often he would answer the questions in a person's heart before the other had had time to ask the questions. Because he had the gift of insight, he also had the gift of foresight. Seeing into the other person, he could understand the direction of that person's life and what was likely to happen to them. Often his words of counsel, his advice, was surprisingly direct and practical. In one instance, recorded for us, a young peasant farmer came to him in tears because his horses had disappeared. And Saint Seraphim told him, "Go to such and such a village. Go down the village street. Take the third turning on the left. Go down this side street, and there in a field you will find your horses." So he didn't just limit himself to comforting comments, but he could be, when there was need, extremely precise. Saint Seraphim also possessed the gift of healing. By laying on his hands, or else just by praying, he cured many people. We have a great many examples of persons whose ailments were healed through his prayers. So as a starets, he offered healing both of soul and body to others, but above all, healing of soul. We could say of the gift of the starets, the spiritual father, it is the gospel made personal. A book will provide the same advice for everybody, and perhaps it will be based on arguments, conclusions drawn from certain basic principles about how we should behave. But a true spiritual guide does not offer the same advice to everyone. He will offer particular words of healing adapted to the specific needs of the one in front of him. So the spiritual father provides not a system, not abstract principles, not rules the same for everybody, but he provides a personal relationship. This particular person, the one who is sitting in front of him, he will, through his gift of insight, say what that person uniquely needs to hear. The gospel made personal. But a true spiritual father, such as St. Seraphim, did not simply provide words of advice. A spiritual father is what is called in Greek anadokos. That means literally a sponsor, the one who acts on behalf of an infant child at baptism, for instance. In this context, the spiritual father is an anadokos in the sense of being a burden bearer. He doesn't simply make suggestions from a safe distance, but he takes into his heart the anxieties, the fear, the problems of the one in front of him. Fyodor Dostoevsky, in his masterwork, The Brothers Karamazov, says of the starets, an elder, is one who takes your soul, your will, into his soul and his will. So the spiritual father takes you into his heart. He helps others because he is able to suffer with them. He has the gift of healing compassion, deep sympathy, and that's why he can bring hope and renewal to other people. If you, from a distance, without caring for the other person, just make suggestions, perhaps these are quite shrewd and appropriate, and perhaps that will help the other person. But the one who can really suffer with the other, who can take their burden upon him, he is the one who will really be able to help. St. Paul says, when one member of the body suffers, all the other members of the body suffer with it. The true spiritual guide is exactly a co-sufferer, one who makes the joys and sorrows of other people his own, a burden bearer who takes others into his heart. So the spiritual father, a figure such as St. Seraphim, does far more than simply give advice. He is an intercessor. He prays for the other, prays with sincerity from the depth of his heart. And perhaps his prayers are more important than his advice. A friend of mine went to see a notable starets or geronta on the holy mountain of Athos, a Greek monk called Father Paisios. And my friend did not speak Greek, so he had another monk who interpreted for him. And at the end of the conversation with Father Paisios, he said to him, "Can I write letters to you?" And Father Paisios said, "No, don't write, but I will pray for you." Now, my friend felt this as something of a rebuff. The monk who had been interpreting for him understood that. And he said to him, "Don't be sad that the elder said, don't write to me. His advice is wonderful, but his prayers are much, much better." So, in saying, "Don't write, but I'll pray for you," Father Paisios was offering to my friend not what was less, but what was more. Saint Seraphim had great power of prayer for others. He used to light candles in his cell to mark the different people for whom he was praying. He said, "Sometimes I don't have time to mention them all by name, but I light candles for them, and then the candle burns to heaven, and that expresses my prayer." His cell was full of candle stands with great mounds of melted wax, and visitors said that the number of candles made it unbearably hot inside his cell. So this is the true starets after the model of St. Seraphim, one who offers counsel, yes, but one who really cares for you, who makes your concerns his own, who takes you into his heart, who prays for you. And this power of intercession, so important for St. Seraphim, extended beyond death. This is what he said to nuns under his care. Memorable words. When I am no longer with you, come to my tomb. Come when you have time, and the more often the better. Whatever you have in your heart, whatever has happened to you, whatever you are grieving over, come and bring it all to me at my grave. Come, fall on the ground, and tell me everything, just as if I was alive. And I will hear you, and your sorrows will fly away and disappear. Speak to me, just as you did when I was alive. Speak to me there, and I will always be alive for you unto the ages of ages. To say those words with a full depth of meaning from your heart, that is not a light thing to do, but that is the gift of the starets, and that was the gift that St. Seraphim had. He freed people from their burden. And he often did that by taking that burden onto his own shoulders. Sometimes when visitors had made their confession to him, he said, "See, all the sins that you have committed from your birth until your death, all these I take upon myself. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ," says St. Paul. And that was precisely what St. Seraphim did during his last years. But of course, the relationship between the spiritual guide and the disciple is a two-way relationship. The guide may offer counsel, take people's sins on himself, pray for them, but the other must also have faith. Faith not primarily in the spiritual father, but faith in God. And then many things are possible. But if you come to see a starets, a great spiritual father or mother, just out of curiosity, you will receive little or nothing. Only if you yourself are truly seeking healing and salvation can the other help you. We have examples of that from St. Seraphim's own life. A monk came to see him from a great distance, and St. Seraphim would not even speak to him, did not give him even a blessing. And after a time, the man left, disappointed, having received nothing. Afterwards, St. Seraphim said to a nun who was present, "Yes, he came from a distance, asking for a blessing, but he doesn't know what he wants a blessing for." So, the spiritual father will not just help you automatically. You too have to play your part. Only if you too are open to the Spirit can you receive assistance and support from the starets. So St. Seraphim expected from others sincerity and seriousness. A spiritual father can change your life if he's someone like St. Seraphim, but that is only possible if you yourself want your life to change. When St. Seraphim was asked, why is it that in our own day we do not see the miracles that happened in apostolic times? He answered, in our own day, among us, there is only one thing lacking, and that is a firm resolve, determination, seriousness, a genuine searching for Christ and his salvation. That's the essential thing. And if we don't have that, the spiritual guide can't really help us. That's why in his own miracles our Lord Jesus Christ expects very often from the other an expression of faith to indicate their seriousness. And from those who were under his care, who came to see him not just for a single visit but regularly, St. Seraphim expected obedience. In St. Seraphim's later life, he had a particularly close relationship with a young man called Michael Manturov, and with Michael's sister Elena. St. Seraphim healed Michael of a serious ailment. It was the first of the healings that he performed, the first but by no means the last. And he asked of Michael that he should give up a great part of his inherited estates and money to help with the women's monastery that St. Seraphim was ministering to. Michael obeyed. Then Michael fell ill, and St. Seraphim imposed a surprising, even a somewhat scandalizing obedience on Michael's sister Elena, who had become a nun. He said to her, your brother is going to die, but I need him for the work I have to do with my nuns. So you must die in his place. And so it happened. She accepted this obedience. Almost at once she fell ill, died. Her brother Michael lived for another 30 or 40 years. The Anglican poet-theologian Charles Williams talks about the mystery of substituted love, that through love we can bear other people's burdens. And this was exactly what happened in an extreme form in the story of Elena Manturova and her brother Michael. That shows that putting your life in the hands of a spiritual guide is a serious matter. The spiritual father or mother may ask of you more than you expected. He or she may even ask you to lay down your life. The story of Helena Manturova dying for her brother has often upset people, but it is part of the story of St. Seraphim and his ministry as Astarias. So, if any of you are interested in looking for a spiritual guide, excellent. I would fully encourage you to do so. You may not find somebody exactly like St. Seraphim, but realize that you are taking on yourself something that is serious. Yes, St. Seraphim usually received his visitors with warmth and affection, but not always so. We do have stories which show that he could be angry and severe. In C.S. Lewis's children's story, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, we have the figure of Aslan, the lion, who represents Christ. And it is said in the course of the story, Aslan is not a tame lion. This is also true of spiritual fathers like St. Seraphim. The stories told of him can sometimes make him look a little sentimental. But when we go back to the sources and look at the way he really behaved, we see too that he was not a tame lion. It is, yes, a serious thing to put your life in the hands of a spiritual guide. Let me tell one out of many stories about St. Seraphim. A distinguished general came to see him. He went into the cell and the door was closed. After a while, the people outside the cell, waiting for their turn to see St. Seraphim, heard a sound of weeping from inside the cell. And indeed, as St. Seraphim talked to the general, he began to cry like a little child. And of the many medals that he was wearing, one by one they fell off. At the end of the interview, St. Seraphim gathered them up and put them inside his military cap and sent him on his way. And afterwards he said they fell off because he didn't deserve them. Let me quote another story which is still more disturbing. These stories tend to get left out of the books about St. Seraphim, but if you read the primary sources you will find them. This story concerns a nun who was a cook in the women's community over which St. Seraphim had spiritual charge. And this nun cook was strict in her ways, and she did not allow the nuns to take a little food with them from the refectory to eat in their cells if perhaps they might feel hungry. And she was told by the abbess, who was also strict, that she was not to do this, that she shouldn't allow them to take food away. When St. Seraphim heard about this, he summoned the cook and began to rebuke her. "What's this, Matushka?" he said. Matushka in Russian means little mother. It's a title that is applied particularly to nuns or to a priest's wife. The corresponding title is Batushka, little father, applied to a priest. Actually, St. Seraphim used to call both men and women who were laymen with whom he was talking Batushka or Matushka. It's a title that shows respect but also affection. "What's this, Matushka?" he said. "I hear you don't allow my orphans to eat as much as they wish." When he spoke of the orphans, he meant the nuns under his charge. And the cook began to make excuses, and she said she was acting on the instructions of her superior. "No, no, Matushka," the saint insisted. "There is no forgiveness for you from me. And as for the superior, so what? It is not she who feeds my orphans, it is I who feed them. Let the superior say what she likes, but you must give them bread without her knowing, and not lock it up." The nun, rebuked in this way, became very distressed, knelt at St. Seraphim's feet, and asked his forgiveness. But he kept saying, "No, no, Matushka, there is no forgiveness for you from me." And with those words he left her without giving her his blessing. So upset was she that she fell ill and soon afterwards died. Now, what are we to make of that story? It's true, of course, that St. Seraphim was not reacting against any slight or wrong that had been done to him. He was protecting his orphans, as he called them, the nuns. But the cook was acting on the instructions of her superior, and she asked forgiveness. Why didn't St. Seraphim extend that to her? The story is bound to leave us disturbed. But if we take the saints seriously, if we don't just make plaster statues of them, but try to learn something about the real person that each of them was, then we will find often many unexpected things, things even which distress us in their lives, things that we don't understand. And I personally don't really understand that story, why he was so severe. He was a saint of love, but love did not mean sentimentality. The saints are often, when we get in touch with the real person, much more startling than we might expect. So, this is the last stage in St. Seraphim's life. He is receiving hundreds, even thousands of people each day. He listens to them. He has the power to speak a word of healing that will transform their lives. Yet he avoided making elaborate claims on his own behalf. For example, he said this to the priest who was chaplain in the women's monastery of which St. Seraphim had charge, Divyevo. "Remember," he said to Father Vasily Sadovsky, "when you hear confessions, you are only a witness. It is God who judges." That reproduces exactly what is said in the Russian rite of confession by the confessor priest to the penitent. Behold, my child, the prayer goes, or the homily to the penitent. Christ stands here invisibly and receives your confession. And then it continues, I am only a witness, bearing testimony before him of all the things you have to say to me. So St. Seraphim did not claim to be the judge. He didn't say that he could heal people. He said it is God who heals and God who forgives. So the purpose of the spiritual father is not to be a kind of substitute figure to come between the spiritual child and the living God. The purpose of the spiritual father is not to be a substitute, but to bring each one directly and personally into God's presence. Exactly, a spiritual guide, a confessor, priest, who has the gift of ministering the sacrament of reconciliation, can do so best by being a faithful witness, so that the penitent himself or herself can speak directly to God. So St. Seraphim was concerned to say, it is not I who heal, it is God who heals. Though he did, on one occasion, certainly claim the power to release people from hell. There was one time when he was engaged in very deep prayer for hours, I think it was said. And afterwards he said, yes, that was very hard. I was asking God to release somebody from hell, and my prayer was answered. So let us not underestimate the power of the spiritual father, but let us not expect him to do everything for us. He will help us, but he can only help us if we are ready to be helped. In the story of the healing by Christ of the paralyzed man beside the pool of Bethesda, Christ says to the man, do you really want to be healed? A strange question. Why had the man been waiting 38 years for the troubling of the waters in the hope of receiving healing? But perhaps, lying on his pallet with other people to look after him, the paralyzed man had reached a certain complacency. He was in some way protected. He had a settled way of life. And so Christ asks him, do you really want all that to be changed? Do you really want to be healed? If you or I go to see a spiritual guide, only if there is true eagerness, only if we are really searching, will the guide be able to help us. If we just come from curiosity, perhaps we shall have an interesting interview. Perhaps we shall go away edified by the holy man or woman. But nothing profound will have happened. So, when we go to see the starets, there must be openness of heart on our part. As the years passed, St. Seraphim's strength diminished. And as he began to approach his 80th year, he knew that his death could not be long delayed. In fact, he died on the 2nd of January in the year 1833, not having undergone a long illness, but just through an increasing bodily weakness. He passed away in peace. The monk who lived next door to his cell heard on the day before St. Seraphim died the starets singing the Easter hymns. So he went to meet his death with a sense of paschal joy. Huge numbers attended his funeral. But, strangely, no homily, no eulogy was given at his funeral. That is very unusual. And there is perhaps a reason for this. It may be that the abbot, Father Nifont, and some of the other senior monks at Sarov did not altogether approve of St. Seraphim. Perhaps they were jealous. Certainly they were upset by the disturbance caused to the life of the monastery by the huge numbers of visitors. This can often happen. The saint in his own day is misunderstood. Only long after his death, when he is safely out of the way, do people begin to praise him. And certainly St. Seraphim, in his last years before his death, had to face misunderstandings. I will say more about that in my next talk.